The bells of the great September of Baelor pealed triumphantly over King's Landing, a measured but relentless chorus that spoke of joy and solemnity all at once. The high, keening sound carried through the muggy air of the city and stirred the crowds like wind blowing ripples across a pond. Nobles in their best finery crowded into the sept, bright silks and embroidered doublets shimmering. Gilded pillars caught the sun's rays that flooded through the stained glass windows, illuminating the mosaic floors in a kaleidoscope of colored light. Between those blazing shafts of brilliance, shadows lingered in corners where they should not be. Outside, the city swarmed with commoners, a throng wanting a glimpse of the new queen, or so they were told. Margaery Tyrell, the sweet rose of Highgarden, was to be wed to King Tommen Baratheon, the boy king who sat precariously on the Iron Throne. It was the second time King's Landing had gathered for a Tyrell bride in what felt like no time at all, and some whispered that Tyrell fortunes were woven from pure gold, for how quickly they rose after each misfortune. Others whispered darker things about Margaery's beauty and cunning, or about the venom that lurked behind Lannister smiles. Inside the sept, the marble floors echoed with the rustle of skirts and the shuffle of slippers. Golden chandeliers hung overhead, swaying gently in the breeze that came through the high windows. Queen Regent Cersei Lannister, clad in a dress of deep crimson with golden thread winding around her bodice like a serpent, stood by a pillar, her posture rigid with tension. Her once beautiful face had grown hard in recent months, her green eyes glimmering with a frustration she hardly bothered to mask. Though she forced her lips into the semblance of a polite smile for the benefit of watching lords and ladies, an undercurrent of anger laced each of her movements. It had not been long since she'd had to watch Margaery Tyrell stand beside her precious Joffrey, before everything ended in poison and chaos. Joffrey was gone, and Cersei's grief had been overshadowed by suspicion, fury, and her cunning quest to keep the Lannisters afloat in a realm increasingly riddled with enemies. Now Margaery was taking Tommen's hand in marriage, spinning that web of Tyrell power and popularity around the new king. Cersei, every inch the lioness, refused to be devoured. Tommen Baratheon himself looked small beneath his crown. Only a boy, he wore a velvet doublet of Baratheon black trimmed with Lannister crimson, which swallowed his slight figure. Beside him, Margaery Tyrell was radiant in a pale green gown that flared at the waist, embroidered with gold roses blooming along the train and at the bodice. A delicate crown of golden roses perched atop her lustrous brown curls, and the sweet smile she gave the king set the gallery to sighing in delight. The high septon, stooped, yet dignified in his robes, went through the marriage rites as throngs of gawkers murmured and jostled. To many, it felt like a reawakening of hope after so many tragedies. With the war simmered down to embers, with the humiliations suffered by the realm over the course of years of bloodshed, the prospect of stability under a new king, bolstered by Tyrell gold and Lannister steel, was cause for cautious celebration. And so, when Margaery stood with Tommen, the populace let out ragged cheers. The couple walked back down the central aisle, and flower petals were tossed from the galleries. Cersei's hands curled into fists within the folds of her gown as she watched Margaery parade through the sept with Tommen's hand in hers. The left corner of Margaery's lips curled, just enough for Cersei to see but not enough to be obvious to others. A smug, triumphant little curve that might as well have been a sneer. After all, had Margaery not captured the hearts of the people, be they highborn or low? She was the gracious rose, the smiling queen so beloved by the masses. She had overshadowed Cersei's influence in the Red Keep more swiftly than a creeping vine overtakes a neglected castle wall. Cersei turned away from the procession, stepping behind a marble column. She shut her eyes to blot out the scene of Margaery glowing with newwed joy. None could say Cersei Lannister was a woman without cunning or daring, and none who truly knew her could doubt that her hatred for Margaery Tyrell had grown as deep and tangled as the roots of the heart tree in the Godswood. But to cross House Tyrell openly was to cross a formidable force, one that controlled the fertile fields of the Reach, one that commanded vast wealth and armies. Even Tywin Lannister in his prime had respected the Tyrells' might, forging alliances with caution. Yet Tywin was gone, and the Lannisters were waging their battles in the shadows, each trying to preserve the diminishing power that had once seemed so absolute. As the guests filed out, trumpets sounded, beckoning them toward the feast at the Red Keep. A sea of color and chatter filled the grand plaza outside. The September vendors hawked pies, sweetbreads, and flags bearing the combined sigils of the Baratheon stag and Lannister lion, alongside the golden rose of House Tyrell. The wedding was as much a performance for the realm as it was a personal celebration for king and queen, and among those costumed festivities, no one looked more splendid than Margaery and her retinue from Highgarden. When the royal party arrived at the Red Keep, they stepped into a courtyard brimming with guards and chatter. Silver plates set on tables of polished oak were piled high with roasted boar, lemons from Dorne, and the spiced wines favored in the reach. Musicians played delicate tunes as the newlyweds were led to the dais at the far end, from which they could overlook the entire great hall. A hush fell over the crowd as Tommen and Margaery took their seats beneath regal canopies. Cersei stood nearby, a wine cup in hand. She drank only sparingly, fully aware of how watchful eyes might perceive her. Her mind was a whir of calculations, recollections, and dark desires. Thoughts of Joffrey's wedding came unbidden. The choking, the purple face, the blame that had spiraled around Tyrion, the chaos that followed. She thought of how Margaery had survived that fiasco unscathed, free to try again with Tommen. A Tyrell bloom rising from Lannister ashes. A hush spread through the crowd when Margaery rose, hand in hand with Tommen, for the ceremonial first dance. Her skirts swirled around her legs, the gold-threaded roses catching the torchlight. Tommen was flush with the effort of keeping up, but Margaery guided him with a gentle grace, her laughter floating above the music. The people around the hall, lords, ladies, knights, and courtiers, watched with faint smiles. Some admired Margaery's charm, others found hope in her diplomacy. But there were whispers, too. Whispers that Cersei's face looked set in stone as she observed them, her lips bloodless around the rim of her wine cup. Then the feast truly began. Servants laid out courses of fragrant fish stews, honeyed hams, bowls of fresh fruit piled in pyramids. One after another, servers brought golden platters sizzling with quail, casks of the arbor's finest reds and whites, enormous pies stuffed with doves that flapped about the rafters when the crust was cut open. Margaery glided between the tables, exchanging pleasantries, radiant, capturing hearts with every passing moment. She did not forget Cersei, meeting her eyes on occasion and offering a courteous nod, if only to stay above reproach. Yet behind those polite gestures, the tension was so thick it could have been cut with a sword. Cersei, for her part, moved among the guests like a specter at her own son's wedding feast. She spoke her niceties when required. She traded barbs with Olenna Tyrell, the Queen of Thorns, who parried every pointed remark with an even sharper retort. Cersei was keenly aware that everything she did this night was under a blazing spotlight. It made her feel trapped, coiled, wanting to lash out yet forced to wait. The night wore on. Music swelled, wine flowed, tongues loosened. Tommen laughed heartily at some jest told by Margaery's brother, Ser Loras Tyrell, who was leaning on the table, a bit flushed from drink but no less graceful in his movements. Lords from the Westerlands tried to curry favor with Margaery, praising Highgarden's bounty. Meanwhile, minor knights from the Reach slipped to the side to speak to Lannister bannermen, forging new acquaintances or reuniting with old ones. Amid this swirl, Cersei observed from a distance, offering little more than a forced smile if approached. Her eyes flicked across the scene, searching for weaknesses, for alliances, for the moment. In her mind's eye, she could already hear her father's voice cautioning her to tread carefully with House Tyrell. But Tywin Lannister was gone, and the seeds of suspicion and rage had grown monstrous inside her heart. Halfway through the feast, Margaery rose with Tommen to accept gifts and the blessings of various lords. One by one they approached. Mace Tyrell, father of the bride, beaming with ill-concealed pride. Grand Maester Pycelle with a pious drone of good wishes. Ser Jaime Lannister with a tense smile, and many more. Cersei offered her gift last, a glittering necklace of hammered gold lion heads to represent Lannister support for the new queen. The assembled courtiers applauded politely, though some swore they could see a flicker of contempt in Cersei's green eyes. When the gift-giving was done, Margaery raised a goblet, calling for a toast. She was poised, regal, her voice a pleasant sound that carried well in the hall. She praised Tommen's gentle heart and sweet nature, lauded the alliance of House Lannister and House Tyrell for bringing peace to the realm, and declared her devotion to the good of the people. The crowd drank to her words, and for a moment, it seemed as though the realm truly might unite behind this Queen of Roses. Even Cersei, stone-faced, lifted her cup. It was then that Margaery turned, meeting Cersei's gaze, and though her sweet smile never wavered, her eyes carried a certain triumph. There are moments in life when a decision is made in the space between one heartbeat and the next. For Cersei Lannister, that moment came as the sweet wine touched her lips. A fiery wave of resentment overwhelmed all caution. She set down her goblet and smoothed her crimson skirts, refusing to look away from Margaery's face. All the old warnings, all the old advice from her father, from Jaime, from Tyrion, everything was drowned out by the pounding of her own heart. Who could say later what exactly triggered the decision in that instant? Perhaps it was Margaery's pride, or the memory of Joffrey's lifeless form, or the dread knowledge that Tommen was slipping away under Margaery's honeyed influence. Maybe it was simply that the wine tasted bitter on Cersei's tongue that night. Whatever the cause, Cersei excused herself from the dais, weaving through the crowd with that same practiced mask of serenity. She found Qyburn lurking near a side pillar, half hidden in the shadows cast by torchlight. He bowed quickly, leaning in as she whispered instructions into his ear. His eyes flickered, uncertain, but he nodded and melted away into the swirling throng of guests. The wedding continued, ignorant of the serpent coiling among them. The dancing resumed, and Margaery, laughing and bright, led Tommen for another turn across the polished floor. Flames and tall braziers flickered, sending reflections dancing across Margaery's golden crown of roses. The music soared, the pipers quickening their pace while the drummers thundered beneath them. When at last the dance ended, Margaery wandered toward one of the smaller exits that led to a courtyard, seeking a moment's respite from the stuffy air and swirl of festivities. A few ladies of her retinue trailed behind, giggling. With an indulgent smile, Margaery encouraged them to return to the dance, saying she only needed a moment to compose herself. The new queen was accustomed to the eyes of the realm upon her, but even she required a moment alone now and again. She stepped out into the courtyard, inhaling the night air. Torches cast a golden haze across the courtyard's fountain. The water trickled over the carved stone, a gentle lullaby in the night. Above, a sky dusted with stars stretched over the Red Keep's towers. Margaery lifted her gaze, momentarily grateful for the quiet. Her lips curved into a self-satisfied smile as she thought of the crowd's adoration, the realm's acceptance. She was queen again, and this time she told herself it would last. She heard a soft step behind her. Turning, she expected a maid or perhaps Tommen, come to steal a private moment. Instead, she found herself face to face with Cersei Lannister. The Queen Regent stood there like a wrathful statue carved in crimson, her blonde hair catching the torchlight. Margaery dipped into a graceful curtsy, her smile reflexive. "My lady, do you come to offer congratulations in private as well?" Cersei's eyes, green as wildfire, bore into hers without blinking. A cold hush fell over the courtyard. "I come," Cersei said, voice so low and measured, "to see what the new queen is plotting out here alone." Margaery's brows rose, but she maintained her composure. "I needed a breath of air. The feast is quite warm. So many find you refreshing," Cersei went on, her tone hollow. "The knights and ladies, even the small folk, they see your sweet smiles, your gracious manner, and they flock to you like flies to honey. My son is quite smitten." Margaery's lips twitched. "I pray that I make him happy. That is what any queen desires, for her king to be at ease." "I imagine so." Cersei stepped nearer. "He's not as strong as Joffrey, not as fierce, but you've already learned that, no doubt. It must be so very easy to bend him to your will." gentle as he is. Margaery tensed, the subtle barb pricking her pride. He is good at heart. That should be cherished, not mocked. Cersei's laughter was a brittle sound. For an instant, neither woman moved. The hush of the courtyard pressed in, and behind them, the festival lights of the great hall flickered through an archway. Then, quietly, Cersei said, "You're nothing but a vulture, picking at the remains of my family. You took Joffrey, and now you have Tommen. And the worst part is that no one sees through you. They lap up your smiles like dogs." Margaery's face darkened. "I loved neither Joffrey nor Tommen as a predator loves prey. I've done my duty by the realm, forging alliances so we might have peace. If you refuse to see that, it is your failing, not mine." A muscle in Cersei's jaw twitched. "You say that, but I see how you manipulate him. My sweet, trusting boy." Margaery let out a careful breath. "He is a king. He can stand on his own, or so I hope. One day, you'll have to let him be his own man, not cling to him like a frightened mother." "Frightened mother?" Cersei repeated, voice trembling with barely contained fury. She advanced another step. "You speak of fear? Do you see the position you hold in King's Landing? By right, it is mine. I am the mother of the king, the daughter of Tywin Lannister. You are an intruder." Margaery's chin lifted. "I am your son's wife, Queen of the Seven Kingdoms, and I have shown you nothing but courtesy, my lady. If there is any intruder here, it is your misplaced venom. This is meant to be a night of celebration." In the flickering torchlight, Cersei's face was taut with tension. Her lips parted slightly, and Margaery saw that the other woman's hand was trembling. She seemed poised at the edge of a precipice, and Margaery had the sudden instinct that perhaps they should not be alone here. She parted her own lips to call for a guard or a servant, to bring them back into the crowd where the eyes of the realm would keep them from each other's throats. But no sound came in time. Cersei's hand darted inside the folds of her gown. The glint of metal caught Margaery's eye only a heartbeat before she felt a sudden, burning thrust between her ribs. There was no time for her mind to fully register the shock as she looked down and saw the jeweled hilt of a dagger pressed against her side, Cersei's hand twisting it deeper. The warmth of her own blood spilled across her gown, blooming like a crimson rose upon the green and gold. Margaery's mouth opened in a silent gasp, and her eyes flew wide with horror and disbelief. Cersei's face was inches from hers, those green eyes blazing with a hatred so profound it eclipsed all reason. "I will not allow you to devour my children," Cersei hissed, her voice hoarse. She pulled the dagger back and stabbed again. A savage, desperate motion. A cry escaped Margaery's lips, finally breaching the hush of the courtyard. She staggered, reaching out instinctively for something, anything, but her hands found only the cold stone of the courtyard wall. Her knees buckled. The pain was like fire flooding her body. She tried to speak, but no words came, just a choking, gurgling sound. Cersei let go of the dagger as Margaery slumped. With trembling hands, the Queen Regent stepped back, her chest heaving, adrenaline pounding in her veins. She stared at the dying woman sprawled against the wall, blood pooling on the ground. Margaery's eyes, wide with terror, flickered to the archway. She managed a ragged exhalation, then fell limp, her jeweled crown of roses tumbling from her head to clatter upon the stones. For an instant that stretched into eternity, Cersei stood transfixed. The clang of the crown rolling away and the splash of the fountain water seemed thunderous in the stillness. Then she heard voices, footsteps, the distant hum of music from the feast. Reality closed in around her like the jaws of a trap. She fled. It took only moments for a serving girl to discover the body. The shriek she unleashed ripped through the Red Keep, cutting the music in half. Servants came running, knights rushed to see what was amiss, and soon the courtyard was filled with horrified onlookers. Margaery Tyrell, the new queen, lay dead in a pool of her own blood, the dagger still protruding from her side. Chaos erupted. Ladies fainted. Men shouted commands, and the hush of a merry wedding feast was shattered by panic. Tommen, hearing the alarm, bolted from the dais with Ser Jaime on his heels. When they reached the courtyard, Tommen collapsed at the sight of Margaery's body, tears running down his cheeks. The boy king's hands trembled as he reached out, not wanting to believe the horror before him was real. Within the hour, the Red Keep had turned into a fortress of suspicion. Swords were drawn, and the gold cloaks doubled their patrols. The Tyrell retinue assembled around Mace Tyrell, who stood pale with shock, while Olenna Tyrell's face set into grim lines. Ser Loras nearly had to be restrained from lashing out at the Lannister guards. Demands for answers came in a tempest from every direction. Who had done this? Why? Tommen, dazed and sobbing, was led away for his own safety as the king's guard formed a ring around him. Cersei, for her part, had slipped away from the courtyard as the alarms rang, but she could not vanish entirely. After a few moments of hiding in a deserted corridor, she realized that she must not appear guilty by her absence. She forced her trembling hands to still, forced her face into something resembling shock, and hurried back into the courtyard, letting out a staged gasp at the sight of Margaery's body. But Lady Olenna's sharp eyes were upon her at once, and though no words were exchanged, the Queen of Thorns saw something in Cersei's face, some flicker, that no performance could entirely conceal. Olenna's lips thinned, and in that instant, if Cersei had any doubt, she knew House Tyrell would not swallow this. They would not be placated by some scapegoat or half-lie. Word spread like wildfire. A hush settled over King's Landing, but it was the hush before the storm. The new queen was dead, murdered on her wedding night. The peace that had so precariously balanced the alliance between houses Lannister and Tyrell was shattered. In the following days, the city braced for retribution. Rumors flew. Some said it was the doing of an assassin hired by a rival house. Some whispered it had been a plot of the crown itself, though none dared speak so loudly. A few even suggested the ghost of King Joffrey had returned to exact vengeance. But in the hearts of the Tyrells, only one suspect mattered: Cersei Lannister. They knew, in that cold and certain way that families sometimes do, that she was responsible. Proving it, however, was another matter. Tommen's grief was overwhelming. He could scarcely rise from his bed, let alone attend to the pressing matters of state. Ser Pounce, his cat, mewed for attention at his bedside, but the boy scarcely noticed. He wept for Margaery, the kind bride who had shown him patience and affection. Cersei tried to soothe him, but her words rang hollow, even to her own ears. She insisted they would find justice for Margaery. In his despair, Tommen barely registered her presence, but something in him sensed the hollowness in her vow. Meanwhile, in the Tower of the Hand, Mace Tyrell conferred with his bannermen and advisors, as well as with the aged but cunning Olenna. Their outraged voices rose. They demanded retribution, demanded the traitors in King's Landing be torn limb from limb. Olenna, calmer on the surface but brimming with fury underneath, insisted on methodical proof. She wanted heads, yes, but she would not lash out blindly. Her granddaughter had been robbed of life. There would be no slipshod revenge. But King's Landing was the seat of Lannister power, and the gold cloaks answered to the hand of the king, officially at least. Trials, accusations, and revelations would be orchestrated by Lannister allies. The Tyrells knew the truth would be smothered beneath Lannister cunning if they stayed. And so, after burying Margaery in a solemn ceremony marred by silent anger, House Tyrell announced their departure from King's Landing. They rode out with their banners furled, but with fury in their hearts. The small folk watched them leave from the windows and alleyways, uncertain what it meant. In the Red Keep, whispers abounded that the Tyrells were planning open rebellion, that they would come back in force. A fortnight later, as the realm still reeled from the dreadful news, that rumor proved true. Word reached King's Landing that the banners of Highgarden had been called, that the armies of the Reach were massing under Tyrell command. Lords Tarly, Rowan, and Oakhart sharpened their swords. Supplies were collected, wagons loaded, ravens sent. Cersei felt dread coil in her stomach as she received news of the Tyrell forces gathering. She had gambled that the Tyrells would remain too committed to the alliance to defy the crown. She had hoped that by pinning suspicion on some cutthroat or minor scapegoat, she could avoid war. But the Tyrells refused to be placated. Their beloved daughter, a queen twice over, had been slaughtered in the heart of the Red Keep. Rage would not be soothed by half-lies. Tommen was ill-prepared to make decisions. Grief had consumed him, leaving him pale and trembling. The council, comprised now of Pycelle, Qyburn, and other Lannister loyalists, advised a show of strength. The crown must not bend to the Tyrells' aggression, they said. Any sign of weakness would cause the realm to fracture further. The memory of the War of the Five Kings was fresh enough that no one wanted a repeat, yet it seemed inevitable that another storm was gathering. In the weeks that followed, the Lannisters summoned their own bannermen from the Westerlands. Knights and soldiers from Casterly Rock marched, bearing the Golden Lion on crimson fields. The Crown commanded the City Watch to bolster their defenses. Word was sent to the Riverlands, though that region was still recovering from the devastation of war. The alliance that had once held the realm from falling into deeper chaos was unraveling like threads pulled from a tapestry. Jaime Lannister saw the trap closing around them. Though he loved his sister as fiercely as he despised her recent choices, he recognized that this war could be the doom of them all. A Tyrell-Lannister civil war would tear the realm apart at its seams. Yet what could he do? He confronted Cersei in private. "You've doomed us," he said, voice low, standing in her chambers as torchlight cast flickering shadows on the walls. "War with the Tyrells is madness. We need them. The realm needs them." Cersei, pacing, whirled on him, eyes wild. "What would you have me do, Jaime? Confess to the murder of their precious Rose? Bend the knee and bare my neck for Olenna's retribution?" Jaime exhaled, shaking his head. "This realm has seen enough slaughter. My hand is gone. I am not the knight I once was. Tommen is barely out of childhood. And you—" He broke off, struggling with the love and anger coiling inside him. "I wish you had not done this." Cersei's cheeks flushed. For a moment, something like regret flickered across her features, but it vanished in a heartbeat. "I did what had to be done. That girl was poisoning Tommen's mind, just as her family sought to devour the throne from within. Better a clean cut now than to let her strangle us all in our sleep." "A clean cut," Jaime repeated, incredulous. "There's nothing clean about this. You used a dagger, sister, and left her corpse to be found at our very doorstep. Now we face a war on our own. The Tyrells are not fools. They're wealthy and strong. They're not unstoppable," Cersei countered, though there was a tremor beneath her bravado. "We have the city, the throne, and the name Lannister still carries weight. Even in the Reach, there will be lords who fear us." "You speak as though father were still here," Jaime said grimly. "But Tywin is dust, and so many of our allies fell away after the last war. We stand on a razor's edge." Cersei lifted her chin. "Then we will fight. For Tommen's sake, for the throne, for House Lannister. Let the Tyrells come. We will meet them with steel." Jaime turned away, unable to mask his turmoil. He feared that steel alone would not suffice. Meanwhile, in Highgarden, the Tyrell forces swelled. Rows of tents sprang up along the Mander's green banks. Banners with golden roses flapped in the breeze, accompanied by the sigils of vassal lords from across the Reach. Soldiers trained daily in the fields, forging themselves into a hammer that could strike at the heart of King's Landing. Mace Tyrell led the muster, red-eyed and grieving, though perhaps more furious than truly sorrowful. Olenna Tyrell, though outwardly calm, was a seething well of revenge. She quietly orchestrated supply lines, alliances, and correspondences. One such correspondence went to Dorne, another to Storm's End, seeking to pry away any lingering Lannister supporters. The seeds of new rebellions were planted in letters sealed with the Golden Rose, appealing to old grievances against the Lions of the Rock. If House Martell or certain Stormlords could be swayed, the Lannisters would be beset on multiple fronts. Another letter was sent north, though the Tyrells scarcely expected aid from the Cold Territory. The North was still in its own throes of rebuilding after betrayal and war. but old alliances sometimes rose from unexpected corners. Within a moon's turn, the Tyrell host had marched as far as Bitterbridge. Spies carried word back to King's Landing that the host was formidable, numbering in the tens of thousands, with cavalry, archers, and well-supplied foot soldiers. The roads leading to the capital were dotted with small skirmishes as outriders clashed with Lannister foragers. The Crown declared the Tyrells traitors. The Tyrells denounced the Lannisters as oathbreakers and murderers. Civil war, once a rumor, became an unavoidable reality. Cersei tried to maintain an air of calm, but inside the Red Keep, tension gripped every corridor. The small folk of King's Landing feared another siege. Recollections of starvation, plague, and brutality were all too fresh. They muttered curses at the memory of the last war, unsure if they should blame the Tyrells or the Lannisters. Some remembered how the Tyrells had helped feed the city, how Margaery had been kind to the poor. A few ragged whispers even spoke that perhaps the Tyrells were justified in seeking vengeance. But those mutters were quickly stifled. Gold cloaks patrolled the streets, ready to silence sedition. In the heart of the Red Keep, Tommen was all but a ghost. He rarely emerged from his chambers, haunted by the violent loss of his bride. The boy prayed feverishly for peace, but the gods offered no answers. The courtiers who tried to comfort him only stirred guilt and helplessness in his heart. Cersei's attempts to console him were brittle. He scarcely knew what to believe. Part of him suspected some vile conspirator had arranged Margaery's death to tear the realm apart. Another part wondered if it could indeed have been his own mother. He dared not ask. The day came when the Tyrell host reached within a few leagues of the capital. Smoke from watchfires rose on the horizon. The Crown mustered its forces along the walls, ballistae loaded, archers perched. Jaime Lannister, despite his missing hand, took command of a large portion of the defending forces. Kevan Lannister, too, tried to coordinate the city's defenses. Qyburn hovered near Cersei, whispering counsel. Across the scorched fields outside King's Landing, lines of Tyrell soldiers appeared, banners rippling in the wind. They did not attempt an immediate assault. Instead, they established a wide encampment, cutting off trade routes and forging a blockade. Supplies in King's Landing soon began to dwindle, and the price of food soared in the markets. Tensions flared, and hungry small folk cursed their new misfortune. In the hush of night, archers from the Reach crept closer, testing the city's perimeter. Skirmishes broke out along the roads. Lannister scouts ventured forth to gather intelligence but rarely returned. It became clear that the Tyrells meant to lay siege. They would bleed King's Landing, starve it out, and attempt to force the Lannisters to surrender or face a direct assault. But King's Landing had formidable walls, and the memory of the wildfire used during the Battle of the Blackwater still haunted many who might consider a direct charge. So the siege ground on, day after day, with neither side willing to yield. Storm clouds rolled over the city, unleashing heavy rains that turned the camps into mud. Disease threatened to spread among the besiegers, while inside the city people starved. Cersei paced the Red Keep's corridors at night, haunted by her choices. The ghost of Margaery Tyrell seemed to follow her with every footstep. Though Cersei refused to speak of regret, the consequences pressed upon her. She had set the realm ablaze, and now she stood at the center of that inferno. If the Tyrells breached the walls, there would be no mercy. Desperate, Cersei sought alliances of her own. She sent ravens to the Westerlands, demanding reinforcements. Raventree Hall and other pockets of the Riverlands might still be coaxed into sending men. But old wounds from the Red Wedding and the bitter memory of Lannister dominance hampered any immediate assistance. Some lords had no appetite for further war. One night, Tommen emerged from his sorrow long enough to confront his mother. Tears brimming in his eyes, he whispered, "The Tyrells demand justice for Margaery. If we only, mother, she was my wife. They want someone punished. If we found her killer, would they not relent?" Cersei placed a hand on his cheek. "Hush, my sweet boy. We will find them, I promise you. And House Tyrell will have no reason to doubt our sincerity." She lied with practiced ease, but Tommen's heart was too pure to see through it. The days dragged on, the siege tightened. Within the city, bread lines formed. Rat catchers found their trade suddenly valuable, as the hungry scrounged for scraps. The stench of too many bodies in too small a space became overwhelming in poorer districts. The Tyrell blockade ensured no fresh supplies arrived. Morale sank. At last, a trumpeted call from beyond the walls announced the arrival of Lannister reinforcements from the Westerlands. Led by a distant cousin of the main branch, they brought a few thousand men, along with supply wagons. Jaime arranged a daring foray outside the city gates to escort those supplies back in. Skirmishes broke out between these Lannister forces and the Tyrell patrols. Arrows rained down. Men in shining armor crashed in thunderous cavalry charges across the muddy fields. The clang of steel and the shouts of wounded men echoed across the plain. In the end, the city gates were opened briefly to bring the supplies inside, though many wagons burned or were abandoned during the chaos. Jaime himself led a gallant charge, despite the handicap of his golden hand. Loras Tyrell, his old rival, was not present. He was recovering from a wound taken in a preliminary clash elsewhere, but plenty of capable knights from the Reach tested Jaime's skill. With skillful maneuvering, the Lannisters managed to get enough food into King's Landing to stave off immediate catastrophe. But the cost in blood was severe. From Highgarden's War Council, Mace Tyrell argued for a direct assault, vowing to avenge his daughter at once. Olenna insisted on caution, not wanting to throw men needlessly against the formidable walls. Yet the blockade had shown itself vulnerable, and time was slipping away. Winter loomed in the not-too-distant future, and the Tyrells feared plague in their own ranks. Anger clashed with strategy in those war councils. Ultimately, they resolved to press the siege harder, perhaps to lure the Lannisters into a decisive field battle. In King's Landing, the small folk's anger began to turn on Cersei as well. She was, after all, the one who had fought hardest against Margaery's influence. Whispers circulated that the king's mother had done away with the queen to keep the power for herself. Even some members of the nobility, once supportive of the crown, began to question the official story. Qyburn tried to maintain some illusions of normalcy, orchestrating puppet trials in which hapless criminals confessed under torture to being involved in Margaery's murder. These forced confessions satisfied only the naive. The Tyrells demanded Cersei stand trial, or at least be questioned by a council of neutral lords. That notion was unthinkable to the Lannisters, and so the lines hardened further. In the still of the night, Ser Jaime confided in Bronn, his sometimes confidant. "This can't end well," he muttered, leaning on a parapet overlooking the moonlit yard. "Even if the Tyrells break first, there'll be blood in the streets. And if they win, they'll put Cersei's head on a spike." Tommen. He shook his head, not wanting to finish the thought. Bronn spat over the wall. "If you want to slip away, now's the time. My Sellsword instincts say we're perched on the edge of doom. It's not too late to vanish." But Jaime shook his head. "He's my son, even if no one dares say it aloud. I cannot abandon him." Bronn shrugged, but concern flickered across his eyes. "Then I hope you have a plan." Jaime did not answer. Days bled into weeks, and the strangling grip of the siege tightened. Tyrell outriders pillaged along the roads, cutting off any Lannister caravans. Inside the walls, the smell of rot clung to the air, and the small folk became desperate. Riots broke out near Flea Bottom. The Gold Cloaks tried to quell the unrest with brutal force, only to stoke further rage. When the Tyrell catapults appeared, it became clear that a real assault would soon begin. Wooden siege towers took shape behind their lines, the hammer that Olenna had thus far stayed. In response, the Lannister forces lined the walls, archers at the ready. If the Tyrells attacked, it would be a bloodbath. In the Red Keep, Cersei paced the corridors like a caged lioness. She felt no fear for herself, only the gnawing dread for Tommen, for the Lannister legacy, for the future. She would not let them tear her down. If the city fell, she would unleash whatever devastation she must to ensure victory, or at least vengeance. A part of her whispered that, should the worst come, She would burn the city to ashes rather than yield it to the Tyrells. The memories of wildfire stashes hidden away in the time of the Mad King lingered in her mind. Yet, as the Tyrell lines advanced, a sudden development took the city by surprise. A raven arrived from the Stormlands. It carried tidings that certain Stormlords, unwilling to see King's Landing fall to a single faction, were amassing troops to intervene. Not out of love for the Lannisters, but out of a desire to prevent the Tyrells from becoming too powerful. This news complicated the Tyrell strategy, forcing them to keep an eye on the southern roads. A new wave of parley attempts began, though with little trust on either side. Mace Tyrell sent envoys to the gates, demanding that Cersei Lannister be handed over for trial, that the crown formally confess to Margaery's murder, and that large reparations be paid to House Tyrell for this grievous offense. The Lannisters refused every point. If they gave up Cersei, it would be as good as admitting their guilt. Besides, Cersei would never allow it. She would see the entire city burn first. Within the Tyrell camp, tempers flared. Some lords wanted a full-scale assault. Others favored waiting, letting the city starve. Lady Olenna, wizened by years of politics, recognized that the Stormlords might exploit any sign of Tyrell weakness. She pressed for a decisive action that would break the crown's hold, but without throwing her men into a suicidal charge. Tension and impatience rippled across the camp. At dawn one day, the Tyrell catapults hurled their first stones. Huge rocks crashed against the outer walls, splintering stone and shattering ramparts. The city's defenders returned fire with scorpions and flaming arrows, setting some of the enemy siege equipment alight. The thunder of war rumbled across the plains, sending terrified peasants running for cover. Ser Jaime took command on the walls, ordering counter-battery fire. Archers picked off Tyrell engineers where they could, but the Reachmen were no fools. They had built mantlets and used shields in disciplined formations. The barrage continued, each side trading deadly missiles. In the distance, thunderclouds gathered, ready to unleash a fresh torrent of rain upon the battlefield. For 3 days, the exchange of siege weaponry carried on. The city's walls held, but cracks began to show in places. The Tyrells, for their part, lost siege towers to Lannister fire, but their supply lines remained strong. Tactically, it was a stalemate, but strategically, the city was still choking under blockade. In the midst of these horrors, Tommen drifted through the Red Keep like a shattered puppet. Each day, the boy king withdrew further into his sorrow. He took no pleasure in meals. He barely responded to instructions. Servants found him in the sept, tears in his eyes, praying for Margaery's soul, for the end of this war, for some miracle. But miracle came, and he was powerless to command it. Then, late one night, a lone figure slipped into the Tyrell camp. A cloaked messenger seeking Olenna Tyrell's tent, carrying a sealed note. Suspicion ran high, but the messenger claimed to bring terms from a faction within the city that wanted to end the war by turning on Cersei. According to the messenger, some in the Lannister ranks were tired of the siege, tired of the Queen Regent's tyranny, and desperate to prevent the slaughter that loomed on the horizon. Olenna listened carefully. Although she was far too shrewd to trust blindly, she recognized that if some portion of the Lannister bannermen were willing to hand over Cersei, or at least sabotage the city's defenses, it could bring a swift end to the war and spare countless lives, so long as the Tyrells kept Tommen intact, ensuring a stable transition. For while Olenna despised the Lannisters, she understood the realm needed a king, and better a malleable boy than a savage war of succession. Negotiations began in secret, even as stones crashed into the walls by day and sparks of flaming arrows lit the night. The messenger slipped in and out of the Tyrell lines, returning to a hidden cell of conspirators within King's Landing. Their plan was dangerous. It required splitting the Lannister forces at a critical moment and ensuring that enough gates would be opened from within when a concentrated Tyrell assault came. If it worked, the city might fall quickly, preventing a drawn-out slaughter. If it failed, the conspirators would hang as traitors. Days passed. Tension coiled tighter than a crossbow string. Cersei, unable to sleep, prowled the corridors of the Red Keep at night, haunted by shadows. She felt the city trembling beneath her, Rumors of conspiracies abounded, but she could not root them out swiftly enough. Paranoia gnawed at her, fueling her hatred. If only Margaery's ghost would vanish, she thought. If only she had never walked into that courtyard. If only, when at last the Tyrells launched their next major assault, it seemed at first a mirror of the earlier clashes. A barrage of boulders hammered the walls, showering defenders with shards of rock. Lannister archers rained arrows down. But hidden within that chaos, a concentrated force of Tyrell knights and foot soldiers massed outside the Iron Gate, while another contingent quietly moved to flank. Ser Jaime recognized something amiss and rode to reposition troops. He scoured the battlements, suspicious of the Tyrell movements. As the thunderclouds overhead began to rumble, the Tyrell horns sounded the charge. Their cavalry thundered forward, pounding across the muddy ground toward the Iron Gate. Lannister defenders braced for the impact. Archers loosed volleys. Knights in scarlet cloaks swarmed to the walls. Then, abruptly, the Iron Gate was opened from within. In the swirl of smoke and confusion, someone had raised the portcullis prematurely, and the heavy doors groaned open. A wedge of Tyrell cavalry seized the chance. They galloped through the gateway, slashing at stunned Lannister guards. The city's defenders reeled. Shouts of betrayal rang through the ranks. Jeers and cheers echoed from the Tyrell lines as they poured through the compromised gate. Jaime, cursing, rode hard for the gatehouse, trying to organize a hasty defense. But the infiltration had already broken the city's perimeter. Panic spread among the defenders, their lines fracturing. Cersei heard the alarm bells tolling. She stood at a balcony overlooking the yard, heart pounding as she saw Tyrell banners streaming into the city. She realized, with a sickening lurch in her stomach, that the conspirators had opened the gates. Rage and terror warred within her. She summoned every guard she could, commanding them to hold the Red Keep. As fighting raged in the streets, pockets of loyal Lannister men tried to rally. But the Tyrell incursion gained momentum by the moment. Civilians fled, screaming, as mounted knights clashed with the city watch on cobblestone streets. Blood splattered the walls of shopfronts. Archers on rooftops took aim, only to be pulled down by Tyrell infantry scaling the structures. It was a rolling wave of chaos. At the heart of the fray, Jaime fought with grim determination. His swordsmanship had diminished with the loss of his right hand, but he wielded a sword in his left as best he could. He tried to keep order among the Lannister lines, but the element of surprise and the conspirators' sabotage had given the Tyrells a commanding advantage. Soon enough, the fighting converged on the Red Keep. The outer gates of the castle complex were shut, guards stationed on the ramparts. Cersei stood on a battlement, gazing at the swirl of battle in the lower wards. If the keep fell, there would be no mercy for her. Her mind flashed with half-formed thoughts of wildfire. She imagined unleashing green flames upon the city, wiping out her enemies in one cataclysmic moment. The madness of the idea half-thrilled her. But then she thought of Tommen. She could not bring herself to murder her last surviving son in that manner. As the Tyrell host pressed closer, led now by Mace Tyrell himself, accompanied by the formidable Ser Talbot Oscary and others, the Lannister defense threatened to buckle. Kevan Lannister tried to hold them at the gates, but more conspirators within the Red Keep opened postern doors, letting Tyrell soldiers flood into the outer wards. Within the castle walls, the fighting was fierce and bloody. Lannister knights, cornered and outnumbered, tried to defend the final approach to the royal apartments. Tyrell archers loosed arrows that whistled through corridors. Smoke from torches and overturned braziers stung the air. Cersei retreated deeper into the Red Keep, dragging Tommen with her, flanked by her personal guards. The boy sobbed at the violence erupting around him, fear contorting his face. Each step took them closer to the throne room or to some last stand. Cersei's eyes darted everywhere, searching for a path to escape or a vantage to rally. Jaime, bloodied and exhausted, forced his way through the chaos to reach them. "It's over," he gasped, sword in hand. "You must surrender. They have the gates, the yard, everything. If you try to fight, Tommen will be lost." Cersei stared at him in disbelief, heartbreak twisting her features. "You'd have me grovel to them? After what they've done? You did this?" Jaime snapped, raw anger in his voice. "But if you love our son at all, you'll bend. They want you, Cersei. If you continue, they will kill Tommen in the chaos. Or drag him off as a hostage." Tommen's tearful eyes flicked from Jaime to his mother. Outside, a swell of shouting indicated that Tyrell soldiers were in the throne room. The clash of steel reverberated down the corridors. Cersei trembled, clutching Tommen's hand. Her fury warred with maternal love. Then the thunder of footsteps echoed. Knights bearing the golden rose on their surcoats appeared, weapons drawn. Leading them, to Cersei's amazement, was none other than Olenna Tyrell, carried in a covered chair by her guards, her gaze flinty. "End this," Olenna commanded, voice cold. "Give me justice for my granddaughter, or see your precious boy torn from your arms and your house cast down." Cersei raised her chin, though tears threatened. "You have no proof, old woman," she spat. Olenna's gaze was withering. "I have all I need. A city that has turned on you, conspirators from your own ranks. And I have Margaery's blood on your hands, though you pretend otherwise. Now kneel." Jaws clenched, Cersei refused. Jaime moved swiftly, grasping her shoulder. "Don't be a fool," he hissed. "We can't win. Surrender, for Tommen's sake." The air was taut, swords half raised. Cersei's eyes flitted to Tommen, who clutched her hand desperately. He was trembling like a leaf. She imagined him put to the sword, or used as a puppet by the Tyrells, or locked in a cell. Horror washed over her. With a trembling breath, Cersei Lannister lowered herself to her knees, head bowed. Gasps rippled among the watchers, Lannister loyalists and Tyrell knights alike. Olenna's expression hardened further, but a trace of satisfaction flickered across her features. "You will be taken into custody," she said softly, "and you will answer for the murder of my granddaughter." Cersei's hatred blazed, but she felt Jaime's hand on her shoulder, a silent plea to hold her tongue. Tommen wept openly. Olenna beckoned, and her guards seized Cersei's arms. She was hauled to her feet. Her gaze flicked around in panic, but she saw only the glint of rose-embossed armor. In that moment, it truly ended. The Tyrells held King's Landing. Soldiers spilled through the Red Keep, detaining any Lannister forces still resisting. Kevan Lannister laid down his arms, hoping to spare further bloodshed. The city's gates were thrown open to the Tyrell ranks beyond. The gold cloaks, leaderless and exhausted, mostly surrendered. Outside, the rain began, a steady downpour that washed blood from the streets. Small folk peered from doorways, uncertain whether to cheer or fear this new change. Some, remembering Margaery's kindness, prayed that House Tyrell would bring relief from hunger. Others worried about the wrath of the Rose or the vengeance of the Lion. In the throne room, amidst the battered columns and wrecked benches, Olenna Tyrell presided as her men seated Tommen Baratheon upon the Iron Throne once again. But this time it was under Tyrell control. The boy's eyes, wide and haunted, stared out at the devastation. His mother stood nearby, hands bound, fury etched in every line of her face. Jaime hovered beside her, pinned by heartbreak, uncertain where his allegiance truly lay. So began a new chapter in the realm. The Tyrell-Lannister War, though short in the grand measure of history, was brutal enough to scar both houses. House Tyrell had vengeance for Margaery's murder, but at a tremendous cost. The Lannisters remained proud, though broken in King's Landing, their power in question. And Tommen, the boy who had lost his bride to his own mother's dagger, sat on a throne more perilous than ever. Outside, the sky wept. In the city below, the funeral bells tolled again, not for a wedding this time, but for the many dead. In the Red Keep's courtyard, where Margaery Tyrell had breathed her last, a dried bloodstain marked the stones. Perhaps the crows would feed on the remains of all that once was. Or perhaps new seeds of conflict would be planted there, destined to bloom in the realm's next season of chaos. In her cell, awaiting trial, Cersei lay awake, haunted by a single memory. The moment of Margaery's eyes going wide, the rush of blood, the dagger in her own hand. She had done it to save her son, she told herself, but in the end, she had all but destroyed him. And so House Lannister and House Tyrell, locked in a deadly dance, found no joy in victory, only a fresh wave of mourning across the Seven Kingdoms. The city, uncertain of its new masters, huddled in the cold of the aftermath. War had come again. Margaery Tyrell's murder had sparked a conflagration that neither cunning nor coin could easily control. And though the crown might gleam upon Tommen's brow for now, the blood that stained Cersei's hands and the realm's memory would never fully wash away. A dull torch guttered in the passage outside Cersei's cell, its light wavering across the damp stone walls and falling in flickers through the heavy iron bars. The cold of her confinement snaked into her bones. She had known many luxuries throughout her life: soft furs, heated chambers, the finest velvets and brocades. But here there was only straw and the stale scent of old mortar. She had a single blanket, threadbare and scratchy, which offered little warmth against the chill of the dungeons. Whenever she closed her eyes, she saw Margaery's face contort in pain, saw the bloom of blood across that perfect green gown. She saw the jeering crowd in the throne room as she bent her knee before the Tyrells, the green eyes of Olenna Tyrell gazing upon her without pity. She saw Tommen, tears streaming down his cheeks, powerless to stop the tide of catastrophe that she herself had unleashed. Her wrists still bore faint red marks where the guards had clamped shackles before hauling her off to this gloom. They had removed the shackles once she was inside, leaving her unbound but with no doubt that she was a prisoner. She heard the scrape of boots on stone at irregular intervals. The Tyrell soldiers who guarded her shifted in and out, delivering meager meals that she scarcely touched. Hunger gnawed at her belly, and yet she could barely eat more than a few bites of bread and a bit of watery broth. No one had come to question her yet. That, in some ways, was worse than any interrogation. She wanted to spit and curse at them, to proclaim her innocence or craft a lie. But she had no one to speak to but the creeping shadows. Nights blurred into days. She occasionally heard faint echoes from above. Swords clanking, heavy doors opening and closing, the distant whimper of other prisoners. The Red Keep's dungeons were labyrinthine, and though Cersei had once confidently navigated its corridors of power, these lower depths felt alien, as though she were in another realm. She tried to focus her mind, to maintain some semblance of composure, but the memories came unbidden. Her father's face, Joffrey choking at his own wedding, Tyrion's mocking grin, the humiliations that Margaery had inflicted upon her with that sweet mask of kindness. And now, the knowledge that she had destroyed the fragile alliance and set the city ablaze with war, only for the Tyrells to win. Even though her heart insisted it had all been necessary, her mind teetered upon a precipice of regret. A key grated in the lock one morning, and the iron door swung open, revealing Ser Talbot Oscry. He was a seasoned knight sworn to House Tyrell, his face hard as granite, short brown hair beginning to gray at the temples. Two other guards followed him in, halberds held upright. The torch in the corridor behind them shed enough light to illuminate the straw at Cersei's feet. She rose to her full height, summoning every ounce of Lannister pride she possessed, though her knees felt weak. "So you've come at last," she said, voice raw. "Is it to put my head on a spike? Or does your Lady Olenna prefer a more creative approach?" Ser Talbot's expression gave nothing away. He gestured, and one guard approached with a length of chain, not unlike a leash, which he proceeded to secure around Cersei's wrists. The other guard locked it with a key. "You'll have your chance to speak," Ser Talbot said tersely. "The council has summoned you to stand before his grace. There will be an assembly and witnesses. I advise you to cooperate. Lady Olenna is not one to show mercy to the unrepentant." Cersei almost laughed. What mercy did they show when they invaded this city and cut down our men? He ignored the remark, turning on his heel. The two guards prodded Cersei forward. She felt humiliation sear her, forced to march under guard like a common criminal. Yet a small part of her recognized that she had dreaded a silent death in these bowels. At least facing them openly offered a chance, however faint, to manipulate the outcome. They led her through winding corridors that gradually rose from the gloom of the dungeons. The air grew less stale, though hardly more pleasant. She passed glimpses of the Red Keep's interior that she had once known so intimately. Now it felt tarnished, as though it belonged to someone else. Tyrell banners hung in certain halls, a golden rose on a field of green, supplanting the Baratheon Lannister sigils she had so proudly displayed. Some of the regal finery still remained, but the presence of new guards, new faces, reminded her that her family's hold on power had been ripped away in the space of a single night. At last they emerged into a large antechamber near the Great Hall. Familiar columns rose on either side, but they were chipped and stained from the recent fighting. One corridor led off to the throne room. Outside, sunlight streamed through windows, but the air in the Red Keep felt thick, weighed down by tension. At the far end of the antechamber, Cersei saw Jaime standing with a cluster of Tyrell soldiers. His golden hand caught the light, though the rest of him was subdued in battered armor that bore scratches and dried mud from the battle. When he met her gaze, she saw a swirl of guilt, anguish, and some emotion she could not name. "Leave us," he said quietly to the Tyrell guards. "She's not going to run anywhere with me here." Ser Talbot nodded reluctantly, giving Jaime a measured look before leading his men back down the corridor. Two of the Tyrell guards remained near the door, but they retreated out of earshot. Cersei stood, arms bound, trying to steady her breath. Jaime stared at her in silence for several heartbeats. "They've called for a formal hearing in front of Tommen," Jaime said at last. "Olenna demanded as much, for the sake of appearances. She wants the realm to see that you'll be judged lawfully. Mace Tyrell is pushing for a trial by judge and council, but the Queen of Thorns insisted it be in front of the king." Cersei's lips curled. "They will use my sweet boy as a puppet. I've no doubt Tommen will be told precisely what verdict to deliver, and he'll do it if only to avoid more death. The poor child is too gentle for a seat so harsh as the Iron Throne." Jaime lowered his eyes. "He's undone by grief and fear. He's not the same bright boy who played with his kittens in the gardens. War changes everyone. You know that." She took a slow breath. "I want to speak to him alone." "They'll never allow it, of course." Jaime's voice was almost too soft to hear. "It might do more harm than good. He's frightened of what all this means." Cersei bristled, but in her heart she knew it was true. The memory of Tommen shrinking away from her after Margaery's body was discovered, tears glistening on his cheeks, haunted her. Perhaps, on some level, he suspected the truth. Perhaps he simply didn't want to face it. "Is there any hope at all?" she asked quietly, her pride cracking for an instant. "Must it end in my head on a spike?" Jaime looked away, jaw clenched. "I've tried to reason with Olenna, but you know how she is. She wants vengeance for Margaery. She wants a confession or justice or both. There are rumors that she'd settle for your banishment to the Silent Sisters, or a different form of punishment, if it spares Tommen further anguish. But the truth is, the Tyrell lords are out for blood." The corners of her lips twitched into a bitter smile. "Blood for blood, then. This is what the realm has become. One endless cycle of revenge." Jaime reached out, gently touching her chained wrist with his good hand. "I never wanted this for you, for us." She almost recoiled from him, but her eyes flicked down to the golden hand strapped to his other arm, that symbol of the war's cost. Part of her, against all odds, yearned to rest her head on his shoulder, to find comfort in the man she had once loved more than life itself. But she was no longer certain if that man existed, and she knew her own heart had hardened like iron. "Did you come to help me, or just to pity me?" she asked, voice cold. He gave a sad shake of his head. "I came to warn you. They want you to speak in front of the entire court. They've gathered lords from the Reach and some from the Westerlands who were willing to bend the knee. Olenna wants a public reckoning, to show that House Tyrell will not tolerate the murder of their kin. If you fight them, if you hurl insults or refuse to cooperate, they'll brand you an enemy of the realm and pass a swift sentence of death." She squared her shoulders, ignoring the ache in her back from sleeping on dungeon stone. "I will not grovel. I'm still a Lannister, If they expect me to beg for forgiveness, they shall be sorely disappointed." Jaime's features flickered with conflict. "Will you at least consider your son's future? If you provoke them into sentencing you to death, what becomes of Tommen then? War has already ravaged the city. The Tyrells would keep him on the throne, but they'd keep him on a short leash. Do you think that's what you want for him?" 1,000 half-formed replies tangled on her tongue, but she found none that made sense in her swirling maelstrom of pride, guilt, and maternal instinct. She jerked her head away and said nothing. Jaime let out a weary sigh. After a moment, he reached into his tunic and withdrew a small piece of cloth, rich crimson embroidered with a golden lion, though the threads were tattered. She recognized it as a scrap from the standard they had once flown at Casterly Rock. He pressed it into her bound hands. "I found it after the fight, a piece of our father's banner. Take it with you, or cast it aside. I don't know if it matters anymore, but I thought, perhaps it might help you remember who you are and who you once wanted to be." Before she could respond, the Tyrell guards returned, accompanied by Ser Talbot, who curtly commanded that Jaime stand aside. The moment ended like a candle snuffed by a gust of wind. Jaime stepped back, tension etched into every line of his face. He looked as though he might speak, but in the end he only turned away. Cersei clutched the scrap of cloth as the guards prodded her forward. They led her along the corridor to the great doors of the throne room, which stood partially open. Torchlight and the pale glow of the overcast sky illuminated the hall beyond. She heard the hum of voices inside. Lords, ladies, soldiers, and courtiers, all gathered for the spectacle. Her breath caught in her throat, but she forced her face into a mask of composure. 2 Tyrell bannermen in green and gold livery pushed the doors wider to admit her. The murmuring of the crowd washed over her like a wave. She saw a sea of faces, some frightened, some grim, some curious. The dais at the far end held the iron throne, upon which Tommen sat, looking so small and forlorn that it twisted her insides. Around him stood the Tyrell lords, Mace Tyrell in robes of dark green, face flushed with tension. Several other Reach nobles, including Lord Randall Tarley, known for his stern discipline, and Lord Mathis Rowan. There, too, was Olenna Tyrell, swathed in a voluminous gown of morning black, her keen eyes following Cersei's progress. Kevan Lannister was also present, standing with a cluster of subdued Westerland's lords who had survived the carnage. A hush descended as Cersei was marched up the central aisle. The gold and red draperies that once dominated the throne room had been replaced by subdued hangings, many bearing the rose of Highgarden in a show of triumph. The dais was cluttered with newly placed chairs, for it seemed the Tyrells had convened a council to witness these proceedings. Cersei's heart hammered as she drew closer. She tried to catch Tommen's eye, but he stared at the floor. The corners of his mouth trembled. She wanted to shout his name, to run to him, hold him tight. Instead, she stood where the guards forced her to stop, about 10 paces from the throne. "Queen Dowager Cersei of House Lannister," declared Ser Talbot in a clipped voice that carried through the hall, "stands accused of treason, regicide, and the murder of Queen Margaery Tyrell. By order of His Grace, King Tommen Baratheon, a hearing shall be held to determine her guilt or innocence, and to decide her fate." Those final words landed like stones in the silence. Dozens of eyes bore down upon her. She lifted her chin, letting her gaze sweep the assembly. None met her with warmth. Many looked at her as though she were a pit viper about to strike. "Begin," said Olenna Tyrell, her voice cutting through the hush. She sat in a tall-back chair near Tommen's right hand. Though she was not perched on the throne itself, it was obvious who wielded the true power here. Mace Tyrell, standing near the front, gave a curt nod. Grand Maester Pycelle, still alive, still ancient, though thoroughly cowed by the new regime, stepped forward to read a formal list of accusations. In his shaky voice, he cited witness accounts that placed Cersei and Margaery alone in the courtyard on the night of the wedding feast, the discovery of a dagger with Lannister lion engravings, though, in truth, it was not so easily traced, the long-standing enmity between them, and the subsequent war that erupted when House Tyrell demanded answers. As Pycelle droned on, Cersei surveyed the faces around her. She spotted Qyburn in the crowd, his expression carefully neutral. He had evidently survived the transition of power, possibly by offering his services to the new regime. She felt a stab of betrayal, though she had expected nothing else from a man who was loyal only to his own pursuits. Finally, Pycelle concluded, stepping back with a nervous bob of his head. Olenna eyed Cersei for a long moment, then nodded toward Mace Tyrell. Mace took a step forward, clearing his throat. His usual bluster was tempered by grief and anger. "Queen Margaery was my daughter," he said in a voice that strained to maintain an even tone. "She was a shining light for the realm, beloved by the people. On the night of her wedding to King Tommen, she was cruelly slain. We demand justice. We have given the crown every opportunity to identify the true killer. Instead, we found deception and delays, culminating in an attempt to shield the murderer." He gestured pointedly at Cersei. "But the realm is not so easily fooled." Cersei's lips parted. She could hear her pulse pounding in her ears, but she forced herself to stand still, posture erect. Mace continued, "In light of the evidence and the subsequent confession of," he hesitated, flicking his gaze toward one side of the room. Cersei's eyes snapped in that direction, searching for the so-called confessor. Ser Talbot stepped forward, clearing his throat. The City Watch interrogated a number of individuals. Some were found guilty of lesser crimes, but one, a certain Tomard of the Red Keep Scullery, stated under oath that on the night of the wedding, he was told by a handmaiden loyal to the Queen Dowager to remain absent from the courtyard. He heard mention of a plan to ambush or harm Queen Margaery. We have his sworn testimony, as well as the handmaidens. They are prepared to speak in open court. A murmur of excitement rippled through the crowd. Cersei felt a cold sweat break out along her skin. She had no recollection of any handmaiden. She had trusted Qyburn alone to make all final preparations. She should have known that the smallest slip would be enough for the Tyrells to spin a noose. Ser Talbot gestured, and two figures were pushed forward by guards. A trembling scullion boy with a pockmarked face and a young woman who wore the plain dress of a servant. They glanced around with fearful eyes, clearly uneasy at being the center of such attention. "They claim," Ser Talbot said, "that the Queen Dowager ordered them to keep away from the courtyard during the final hour of the wedding feast, under threat of punishment." The handmaiden overheard an argument between Queen Cersei and Queen Margaery. She saw Queen Cersei produce a dagger. Cersei's mind swirled. She remembered no direct witnesses, but perhaps a fleeting shape in the shadows, a single glimpse, had been enough. She felt all eyes upon her. Olenna Tyrell nodded to the pair. "Speak if you have truth to tell." The boy Tomard swallowed hard. I was told by the lady's maid, who said Lady Cersei didn't want no one in the courtyard. I never saw the killing, I swear it. But the lady's maid said it'd be best if I wasn't there, or I'd regret it." All heads turned to the maid. She flinched, twisting her hands together. I only saw them from a distance. Her Grace, Queen Margaery, tried to pull away. Queen Cersei had something in her hand. I didn't see blood, only that Queen Margaery cried out. And then I ran. I didn't want to see more. Cersei felt fury surge in her. She might have recognized this girl's face if not for the utter panic of that night. Perhaps the girl had been too far away to be certain of what transpired. And yet, fear and rumor could convict. Mace Tyrell seized the moment. "These witnesses confirm that Cersei Lannister arranged to confront my daughter alone, in a secluded spot, carrying a hidden blade. Queen Margaery's body was found with 2 fatal stab wounds, inflicted by a short blade." He gestured to the dais, where, with a flourish of cloth, a guard lifted a velvet-lined box. Within it lay a dagger with a lion's head pommel. It looked uncannily like the one Cersei had used, though she could not be sure it was the same. This weapon was discovered stained with blood, near the scene. The handmaiden identified it as resembling the one she saw. Cersei's mind reeled. Her own memory of that night was a blur. She had used a blade that Qyburn provided, or that she'd hidden away herself. It had been frantic, uncontrollable. Now, under the glare of a public forum, every step was twisted into a chain of damning evidence. Olenna Tyrell turned her keen gaze back to Cersei. "You may speak, if you have anything to say in your defense." A hush fell. The watchers leaned forward expectantly. Tommen lifted his gaze for the first time, eyes brimming with tears, silently pleading for this nightmare to end. Cersei felt her heartbeat thunder in her ears. She could attempt a denial, call the witnesses liars, blame some other hand, insist this was a Tyrell plot to cast her down. But would it matter? The hall was full of Tyrell sympathizers, and even the Westerland's lords would not risk open defiance now that the city was firmly under Tyrell control. She could see Kevin Lannister's face, pale and resigned, behind a row of Tyrell bannermen. Slowly, she took a breath. You produce a pair of frightened servants. Perhaps they truly believe what they say. But you have no proof I wielded that dagger. I loved my son's queen as a mother might love her daughter. The words tasted like bile as they rolled off her tongue. I would never harm someone so dear to the realm. Mace Tyrell let out a bark of anger, but Olenna raised a hand, keeping him silent. You speak of love, yet the entire court knows you despised Margaery. Her lined face was impassive, as if carved from stone. She overshadowed you, charmed your son, and claimed the love of the small folk. If you have some explanation, some miraculous truth that absolves you, speak it now. Cersei's nails bit into her palms where her wrists were chained. The only explanation is that someone else used this blade and seized upon the chance to incriminate me. Did you not consider that my enemies might have arranged for these so-called witnesses? A stir went through the hall. Olenna's lips thinned. Who would benefit from Margaery's death but you? Any number of foes, seeking to pit Lannister against Tyrell, Cersei countered, though she knew how feeble it sounded. The realm is full of schemers, Littlefinger, Varys, those who remain loyal to Stannis Baratheon's memory, if any do. Even your own house might contain ambitious elements. You assume I am the only one with reason. Lord Randall Tarley's stern voice interjected, echoing across the hall. We have no shortage of reason to suspect you, Lady Cersei. Not only were you last seen with the Queen, you have a well-known hatred for House Tyrell. We are not fools, and we will not be swayed by your insinuations. Cersei glared at him, hating the man for his blunt arrogance. She raked her eyes over the watchers, considering if there might be any advantage to a bold lie, an emotional outcry, or a direct confrontation. But she found no friendly faces. Even Tommen seemed lost, paralyzed by grief. Then Olenna spoke again. Since you wish to claim innocence, you will be permitted a trial. But it will not be some Lannister mockery. A council of lords and septons will weigh the evidence, and you will stand before them. She paused, letting that sink in. Or, if you prefer, you may confess now. Spare the realm further upheaval, and we shall show you mercy. Your life or a portion of it might be spared. We are not savage, but we do not suffer liars and murderers gladly. A tense silence stretched. Mace Tyrell folded his arms, face taut. The crowd seemed to hold its collective breath. A single cry echoed from outside, some distant part of the city. Cersei's heart pounded. She could see it in Olenna's eyes. The old woman wanted more than just a guilty verdict. She wanted contrition and humiliation. She wanted Cersei to break before the realm that Margaery had once charmed. But that was something Cersei could not do. She would rather die than bend that far. Lifting her chin, she let out a slow exhalation. Then convene your trial, she said, bitterness lacing every word. I will not kneel before you, nor will I confess to your fabrications. If you must stage this farce, so be it. A ripple of tension moved through the assembly. Kevin Lannister closed his eyes for a moment, as though bracing himself for the consequences. Tommen made a small, helpless sound, as if he wanted to protest but had no voice to do so. Olenna's expression hardened. Very well, take her back to her cell. Summon the council of judges within 3 days. We shall have the truth, one way or another. The Tyrell guards seized Cersei's arms. She flicked a final glance at Tommen, praying that he might stand and call out for her or demand her release. But the boy king hunched forward on the iron throne, shuddering with silent tears. The sight was a knife to her heart, but it did not shake her resolve. She was half dragged back through the throne room, the crowd parting to let her pass. Accusing stares pressed in on her from all sides. They led her once more into the corridors, and she wondered if she would again be cast into the dungeons for more sleepless nights. But Ser Talbot turned them down a different passage this time, less dank and forbidding than the depths below. They came to a modest set of chambers once used for minor courtiers. Inside was a bed, a small table, and a single window set high in the wall, likely the best they would offer a prisoner of her rank. There was a guard post stationed outside the door, and the windows were fitted with iron bars. Even so, it was an improvement from the dungeon. Ser Talbot released her into the room, removing her chains but leaving the door guarded. "This is your new cell," he said, voice stiff with formality. "You will remain here until your trial. If you attempt escape, you will be killed. Food will be brought thrice a day. Speak no more of conspiracies, my lady. Rest if you can." With that, he withdrew, leaving her alone. Cersei staggered to the bed and sank down on its edge. Her entire body shook with a flood of emotion. Anger, fear, heartbreak, all mingled in her veins. She tried to steady herself. She was alive, at least. That was something. She would not yield. She was a Lannister of the Rock, and no old woman would break her. But as she gazed at the barred window, she could almost taste the futility. She might keep her pride, but at what cost? If the Tyrells had arranged the testimony of those witnesses, there would be little chance of an impartial hearing. Her best hope might be to find some crack in the Tyrells' armor or an ally in the shadows. She lay back, letting her exhaustion pull her down. The mattress was lumpy, but far better than stone. Closing her eyes, she imagined Tommen as he used to be, smiling in the gardens, offering breadcrumbs to birds, innocent and carefree. How had it come to this? She felt, for a moment, the sting of tears threatening. Her jaw clenched. She would not cry. She would think, plan, and survive. That was the only choice left. Days passed in a haze of apprehension. She heard the news from the guards posted outside. The Tyrells were busy consolidating control. They had begun distributing food to the starving populace, using the Reach's abundant harvests to quell unrest. Already, the small folk were warming to their presence. Rumors spread that the new king's hand would be Mace Tyrell or perhaps Lord Tarly, with Olenna serving as a de facto regent until Tommen came of age. King's Landing was awash with speculation about what the future might hold. Cersei had few visitors. Once, Pycelle crept in to bring a list of formal questions for her upcoming trial, speaking in a quavering voice, as though he feared the guards might overhear. He seemed uncertain whether to address her as Your Grace or something else, eventually stumbling over his words and calling her Lady Cersei. She responded with ice-cold silence. Pycelle left in a hurry, though not before handing her a piece of parchment containing the formal charges. On another occasion, Kevan Lannister entered her chambers, escorted by 2 Tyrell guards. Kevan was subdued, lines of worry etched into his face. He tried to speak gently about the importance of cooperating, of ensuring Tommen's well-being, but Cersei dismissed him with a sneer. She could see the guilt in his eyes, the knowledge that he was powerless to aid her without risking a total purge of Lannister influence. He left looking even more defeated. A day before her trial, Jaime came. This time, the guards allowed them a few moments of privacy, though they remained watchful in the corridor. Jaime wore a plain tunic of Lannister red and breeches scuffed by weeks of conflict. He carried a small leather pouch, from which he withdrew a few apples. "They're from the Reach's new supply," he said, setting the apples on the narrow table near the bed. "I thought you might want something fresh to eat." She eyed them warily. "You trust that they're not laced with poison?" He gave a hollow laugh. "Poison is too subtle for what they want from you. They'd rather make a public example." Cersei remained seated on the edge of the bed. "So tomorrow is the trial," she said. "Have you come to witness my downfall?" or deliver me into their hands." His face contorted with pain. "I've come because you're my sister, and I can't let this happen without a word." She stared at him. "You can't stop it, can you?" He slowly shook his head. "No. The Tyrells hold all the power now. The city's on the verge of seeing them as saviors, suppliers of food, keepers of peace. They won't risk their popularity by letting you go free. The best I can do is beg for clemency on your behalf. Maybe secure an agreement that your life be spared if you... He broke off, struggling with the words. She gave him a withering look. "If I what? Confess? Beg for forgiveness from that old crone." Jaime pressed his lips together. "Think of Tommen. If you are executed publicly, the last shred of his innocence might die on that day. He's already near broken." Silence hung between them. A faint breeze stirred the meager curtains over the high-barred window. Cersei picked up one of the apples and turned it in her hands, her eyes fixed on the red-green skin. "When I was a child," she said softly, "I used to run through the orchard at Casterly Rock. The fruit would fall to the ground, bruised and half-eaten by birds. But some of it was sweet, worth the risk of pick. I enjoyed it before the crows got to it. I'd climb the branches in my skirts, tearing them, but I didn't care." Jaime watched her, uncertain. She gave a brittle laugh. "That was so long ago. Everything seemed simpler." Then she set the apple aside. "I cannot yield to them. My pride won't permit it, and even if I did, they'd treat me as a powerless figurehead. I'll not be their pawn." He exhaled a shaky breath. "Pride can cost you your life. It may cost me more than that," she said, stealing her gaze. "But I've lost too much already to grovel before Margaery's grandmother. Let them try me." Jaime bowed his head. "Then I will do what I can. But it might not be enough. Do you understand?" She nodded once, a slight inclination of her head, eyes burning with an inner fire. The guard tapped on the open door, signaling Jaime's time was up. He gave her one last look, the depth of his sorrow laid bare, before he turned and left. That night, Cersei hardly slept. She paced the small chamber, the flicker of a single candle throwing elongated shadows on the walls. Every so often, she bit into one of the apples, savoring the crisp tang and juice. She felt the weight of memory pressing down upon her. She thought of her mother, who died too soon. She thought of Joffrey, lost to poison, and Myrcella, far away in Dorne, presumably in harm's way. She thought of Tommen on the throne, a puppet for the Tyrells to manipulate. And above all, she thought of Margaery Tyrell lying in a pool of blood, the dagger in her side, her eyes wide with shock. That moment had led to all of this. By dawn, a pale gray light filtered through the barred window. She felt as though she had not blinked once during the night. She forced a drink of water down her parched throat, refusing the meager breakfast the guards brought. She would not trust Tyrell bread and Tyrell milk on the day of her trial. She might need her wits sharper than ever. Soon enough, a line of soldiers arrived, led by Ser Talbot once again. He ordered her wrists bound, not tightly, but enough to make the statement. She did not protest. They led her through twisting corridors, passing knots of courtiers who paused to stare at the spectacle. The atmosphere in the Red Keep was tense, as if everyone was braced for a culminating moment. At last, they entered a smaller hall than the throne room. It was typically used for official hearings and audiences, with rows of benches arranged on either side. A raised platform at the front held a wooden chair for the accused, and a table before it for the presiding council. At the rear, Tommen sat behind a wide dais, flanked by Olenna Tyrell, Mace Tyrell, and a cluster of lesser lords. A half-dozen septons in robes of bleached white stood nearby, their hands clasped in front of them. The hall was packed. Lannister bannermen mingled nervously with Tyrell knights, and there were a few storm lords who had arrived in the city as well, perhaps to gauge the balance of power. A group of gold cloaks stood in a corner, appearing unsure of their new allegiances. The entire realm seemed balanced on a razor's edge, waiting for a single push to send it tumbling. Cersei was led to the chair, where the guards removed her shackles. She sat, shoulders straight, refusing to avert her eyes from the dais. Tommen's gaze flicked to her, then away. He looked paler than ever. Olenna Tyrell wore a somber gown of gray, her face schooled to impassivity. A large book lay on the table in front of the septons, likely containing the seven-pointed star, from which they would read the solemn words of judgment. Grand Maester Pycelle rose shakily from a seat on the dais and began to speak. "We come together in the sight of gods and men to address the charges of murder and high treason levied against the Queen Dowager, Cersei of House Lannister. As King Tommen Baratheon presides, these lords and septons shall weigh the evidence, with the aim to determine the guilt or innocence of the accused." His voice rattled on, reciting formalities about the faith, the crown, and the duty to uphold justice. Cersei stared at Tommen. He would not meet her eyes. She thought she detected a faint tremor in his lower lip. At a signal from Olenna, a tall, hawk-nosed septon stepped forward, presumably designated to lead the questioning. "Cersei Lannister," he intoned, "it is alleged that you did, on the night of King Tommen's wedding to Margaery Tyrell, lure the queen into a secluded courtyard, produce a dagger, and stab her multiple times, causing her death." His words sent a shiver of recollection through the hall. Many of the watchers averted their eyes in discomfort. Cersei's mouth set into a firm line. "I deny it," she said. The septon nodded. "You shall have the chance to present your denials, but first we shall hear the testimonies." One by one, the prosecution's witnesses came forth. The same scullion boy, the same handmaiden, each restating their claims in quavering voices. A pair of Tyrell guards described discovering the body and the dagger. A Lannister knight who had been on duty that night admitted that he saw Cersei passing from the feasting hall toward the courtyard. All of it wove a damning tapestry, though none had witnessed the actual moment of stabbing. Next, the septon turned to Cersei. "You may call any witness you wish, or speak on your own behalf." She clenched her fists on her lap. Whom could she call? Jaime might speak in her defense, but his testimony would be worthless to these watchers, who knew him as her lover and brother. Qyburn was likely compromised, subservient now to the new regime. Pycelle, for all his false courtesy, would sooner grovel to the Tyrells than risk their ire by defending her. Kevan might say a few words about her being a devoted mother, but that would not absolve her of murder in the eyes of the court. And so she stood, slowly, letting her gaze roam the assembled lords. "I am not guilty of this crime," she said in a voice that carried. "The Tyrells have manipulated the narrative to gain power, and they needed a scapegoat for their beloved Margaery's death. I have no illusions about the outcome you desire. But I say this, I loved my son. Would I truly do something so vile as to murder his wife, knowing it would bring him heartbreak and sorrow?" A hush fell, broken only by the clearing of throats and the rustle of fabric. She saw Mace Tyrell's face darken. He likely wished to bellow in rage. Olenna, however, remained composed, giving only the faintest shake of her head. "I call no witnesses," Cersei went on. "I have none who can truly exonerate me in your eyes. But I ask you to reflect on the chaos that has ensued. Who truly benefits from Margaery's death? The Tyrells seized the city. Now they control King Tommen. The small folk celebrate them for feeding the hungry, and they stand poised to shape the realm as they wish. Their beloved queen was a martyr for their cause." Mace Tyrell burst out, "How dare you imply?" But Olenna placed a hand on his arm, urging silence. The septon frowned. "That is a grave accusation, my lady. Are you suggesting House Tyrell orchestrated the murder of their own daughter?" Cersei's jaw tensed. The moment she'd started speaking, she realized how wild it sounded. Even she could hardly believe the Tyrells would sacrifice Margaery. And yet, desperation made her lash out. "I imply only that House Tyrell has exploited the tragedy with unseemly haste. Is that not plain for all to see?" A low murmur swept the crowd. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others exchanged uneasy glances. Olenna leaned forward slightly. "My granddaughter was dear to me," she said, her tone icy. "I would cut off my own hand before harming her. Do you hear me? You suggest I used Margaery's death as some stepping stone to power? You truly have no shame. Cersei felt her face flush with anger. If you truly loved her so, why did you bring this city to siege rather than seeking the truth through diplomatic means? Olenna's eyes narrowed. We tried. We demanded an investigation. You and your loyalists gave us only evasions, scapegoats, forced confessions. I have been playing this game since before you were born, girl. I know a serpent when I see one. You took my sweet Margaery's life for your own twisted reasons. The Septon raised his hands, calling for order. Enough! We are here to judge facts, not fling insults. He turned to the Council of Septons and Lords. We have heard the evidence and the rebuttal. Unless the accused has more to say. Cersei's mind raced. She saw the entire hall waiting, expectant. What more could she possibly add? She drew a breath to speak, but no words came. There was nothing else. She looked to Tommen again, hoping against hope he might intervene. But he only gazed at her with stricken sorrow. In that silence, Olenna turned to the council. We have enough to pass judgment. My granddaughter's murderer stands before us, unrepentant. A flutter of dread coursed through Cersei. One by one, the council members cast their votes or gave their statements. Lord Tarly declared that the evidence was strong enough to convict. 2 of the Septons insisted they must heed the witness testimonies. Kevin Lannister tried to speak, voice wavering, proclaiming that the realm needed mercy, but his words faltered under the glare of the Tyrell majority. Finally, Olenna rose, resting her hand on Tommen's shoulder in a theatrical gesture of guidance. His Grace will render the final judgment, she said, turning to the Boy King. Tommen's breath quivered. He looked at Cersei, tears filling his eyes. Then he swallowed and spoke in a voice so soft that the watchers had to lean forward to hear. We find her guilty. The hush that followed was deafening. Cersei felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Her son's voice echoed in her mind, condemning her, albeit haltingly, to a fate she could scarcely imagine. An instant later, Mace Tyrell let out an exultant exhalation. Olenna's face hardened with satisfaction, yet she offered a facade of dignified mourning, as though any show of triumph would be unseemly. The Septon lifted both hands. It is the judgment of the crown and the faith that Cersei Lannister is guilty of murder and treason. Let us pass sentence. A jolt of fear set Cersei's heart pounding. She was a breath away from execution. She could feel it in the air. She braced herself, almost wishing she had hidden a dagger somewhere, that she might fight her way out. But that was fantasy. She was unarmed and surrounded. Olenna Tyrell took a step forward. There are many who clamor for her head, she said, voice ringing clear. But, in memory of my granddaughter's gentle heart, we offer a lesser punishment on one condition. The entire hall seemed to lean in, waiting. Cersei stared, uncertain. Olenna continued, If Cersei will confess her crime and show contrition, we may spare her life. She would be stripped of all titles, her lands forfeit to the crown, and exiled, perhaps to the Silent Sisters, where she can spend her days in repentance for her sins. She would never again threaten the realm. Gasps and murmurs rose among the assembled. This was a more lenient proposal than many had expected. Some, especially the Tyrell bannermen, looked displeased, muttering that death was too good for her. But Olenna held her ground. Margaery was a merciful soul, she said, loud enough for all to hear. This is how we honor her, by showing mercy when we might have demanded blood. Tommen blinked in confusion, clearly not forewarned of this possibility. Mace Tyrell sputtered at first, but after a stern look from his mother, he closed his mouth. Kevin Lannister, looking as though he might collapse with relief, whispered something to the Westerland's lords. The tension in the hall was palpable. Every face turned to Cersei in anticipation. Cersei slowly stood. Her voice came out as a ragged whisper. If I accept, you want me to grovel, to proclaim some false remorse? Her entire body trembled with a mix of fury and despair. Olenna's eyes were like cold steel. False or true, the realm needs it. You kneel, you speak your guilt, and you will be taken to the Great September to atone, then escorted from the city. We do not wish to see you again." Cersei's gaze darted to Tommen. She saw the pleading in his eyes. He wanted her alive, no matter the cost. Jaime stood somewhere behind the crowd. She sensed, and she could picture the anguish in his face. For an instant, she wavered, imagining a life of silent captivity, cut off from power, from her family, from the everyday intrigues of court. It would be a living death, but she would breathe. Perhaps she could plot and escape. Perhaps she could rebuild. Yet the idea of kneeling, confessing to the entire realm that she was a murderer, felt like an unimaginable humiliation. She was Cersei Lannister, daughter of Tywin, mother of kings. The hot coil of pride in her breast rebelled against the notion of bowing to Olenna Tyrell. A hush stretched long as she stood there, on the precipice of fate. She thought of Tommen. She thought of how the Tyrells would keep him docile and alive. Would they? Or would they discard him once she was gone? Her mind spiraled with possibilities. Time seemed to slow. She saw Olenna's expectant face, the glower of Mace Tyrell, the measured gaze of the Septons, the anxious stir of the Watchers, the tear-streaked cheeks of her only living son. All hinged on her next words. The hall was so quiet that the scratch of her foot against the stone floor was like thunder. She spoke in a low voice, letting the syllables drop like stones into a well. "No!" An audible ripple of shock swept the chamber. Olenna's eyes narrowed. "No." Cersei lifted her chin. "I will not confess. I'd sooner die than spout false remorse. Margaery Tyrell was a cunning little rose, and if I ended her life, then it was only to protect my own blood. I stand by that. Go on, be done with it, and see if your mercy extends beyond hollow words." A collective gasp raced through the crowd. Even some of the Tyrell knights looked taken aback by her open admission. Tommen let out a soft cry, the heartbreak plain on his face. Olenna's expression froze, while Mace gave a triumphant snarl, as though this was exactly what he had hoped to hear. "All your talk of scapegoats," Olenna whispered, voice deadly, "was a lie then. You truly did it." Cersei met her gaze without blinking. "I do not cower before you, old woman." A moment of stunned silence followed. Then pandemonium. Some in the crowd roared for her head. Others stared in horror, uncertain if they had just witnessed a final act of madness. Kevin Lannister tried to speak, but his voice was drowned out. The Septons retreated from the dais, looking aghast. Olenna herself glowered, fury twisting her features. Mace Tyrell stepped forward. "Guards, seize her." But Olenna raised her hand, wresting control of herself and of the situation. She fixed Cersei with a glare so intense it could have melted steel. "So be it. Since you have refused any vestige of mercy, we sentence you to death. The headsman shall do his duty at dawn." A roar spread through the hall as the Watchers reacted. Tyrell soldiers moved in, grabbing Cersei's arms. She felt their grip, but her mind was strangely calm, as if a dam had broken inside her. She had spat in Olenna's face, thrown aside the last scrap of a possible reprieve. For a heartbeat, she felt a savage satisfaction. Tommen cried out, "No, she's my mother." But the Tyrell guards closed ranks around him, and Olenna turned, her voice commanding but not unkind. "Tommen, hush. It's done. Her crime is beyond measure." Cersei tried to catch a final glimpse of her son, but the swirl of bodies tore them apart. She was forced from the hearing hall, carried along by a throng of shouting knights. Some spat at her, calling her a monster. Others stared in grim silence. She felt no fear, only a numb sense of inevitability. They took her not back to her chamber but to a higher tower cell, as if to ensure there would be no possibility of rescue or flight. A trio of Tyrell men stood guard outside. She was shoved inside with little ceremony, the heavy wooden door slamming shut behind her. No furniture graced this bleak chamber, just a single arrow-slit window high above the floor. She leaned against the cold stone wall, sliding down until she sat on the floor, her heart hammering. So this was how her life would end, with the executioner's blade at dawn, and the realm cheering her death. She closed her eyes, memories flooding back in a torrent. The pride she took in Joffrey's coronation, the sweet moments with Myrcella, Tommen's gentle smile when he first played with Ser Pounce, her father's stern lessons, Jaime's forbidden caress. And now, the unstoppable clang of doom. Outside, she could hear the city stirring with the news, voices traveling through corridors, braziers being lit against the gathering dusk. She pictured dawn's first light creeping over the rooftops, shining upon the gallows or the block. Would they do it in the throne room? In the yard? The specifics did not matter. Hours passed, or perhaps only moments. Time seemed impossible to track. Footsteps approached the door. The latch lifted and one guard opened it. Another guard, holding a torch, peered inside. "Someone's here to see you," he said curtly. "You've but a few minutes." She wondered if it would be Tommen, though she doubted it. Would they let him see her now that the sentence was passed? But a different figure stepped in, Jaime, face wan, eyes burning with anguish. The guards closed the door behind him, offering them a measure of privacy. Jaime stood there, searching her face as though looking for some sign of the sister he once knew. "Why?" he whispered, voice quavering. "Why throw away your life when you could have confessed?" she said, her tone bitter. "Knelt and begged like a common criminal? Would you respect me for that? Would Tommen?" He closed his eyes briefly. "I don't want you dead. None of this is worth your life. Margaery." He trailed off, his thoughts tangling. Then he regained some composure. "I'm trying to find a way out for you, but they're all celebrating your downfall. Olenna is set on your execution, and Mace Tyrell wants to parade your head through the streets." She laughed without humor. "That's hardly a surprise." Jaime dropped to his knees beside her. The torchlight from the corridor flickered across his features, illuminating the lines of despair etched there. "Let me get you out. Let me talk to men who might be bribed. We can run, flee across the sea, or somewhere. There must be a way." She placed a hand on his cheek, feeling the stubble there. "They hold the city in a vice. The Tyrell Knights outnumber any Lannister loyalists. The Gold Cloaks have no love for me. Kevin can do nothing, and any attempt to break me free would end in a bloodbath. They kill you, Jaime. Then who would stand by Tommen?" His voice cracked. "What use am I to Tommen if he sees me fail to save you?" Cersei's throat tightened. "Perhaps you can guide him even after I'm gone. He'll need you more than ever," with the Tyrells twisting him to their liking. Tears rimmed Jaime's eyes. She had seldom seen him so undone. "I can't lose you." She managed a sad smile, stroking his hair as she once did in secret. "We've both lost so much already. This too is the price we pay." He swallowed, searching for words. For a moment, the fierce knight was but a grieving man, burdened by love. He kissed her forehead, tears slipping down his cheeks. "I'm so sorry." She closed her eyes, savoring the warmth of him. "We made our choices, Jaime. I regret nothing but that I never had the power to keep our children safe from the world's cruelty." He clung to her, but the time was short. One of the guards knocked on the door, giving them a warning. Jaime rose unsteadily. "I'll come back before dawn," he whispered. I'll do whatever I can, even if it's madness." Cersei knew it was hopeless, but she did not say so. She only nodded, letting him slip away. The door closed, and she was alone again. A dull numbness spread through her limbs. She could almost wish she had taken Olenna's offer for Tommen's sake. But it was too late now. Her pride, or her madness, whatever one called it, had sealed her fate. Night enveloped the city. From the high arrow slit, she heard distant sobs of wind, the hum of people preparing for the grim spectacle at dawn. She wondered if Tommen was sobbing into his pillow, or if he was too numb to cry. She wondered if Myrcella, in distant Dorne, would ever learn of how her mother died. Perhaps Tyrion, wherever he was in exile, would laugh at the irony. She tried to remain composed, repeating the Lannister words, "Hear me roar," like a prayer, but her voice felt empty. Eventually, exhaustion claimed her, and she drifted into a restless doze, huddled against the cold stone. She awoke to the clash of the guard's armor outside, startled. A faint gray light seeped through the slit in the wall. Dawn was near, her pulse hammered. She rose to her feet, pacing the small cell, her breath coming in ragged bursts. Any moment now they would come for her. Footsteps approached again, heavier this time. Her chest tightened. The door swung open, revealing 4 Tyrell guards. One carried a coil of rope, another brandished a sword. Behind them stood Ser Talbot, his face stony with grim duty. He said nothing, only gestured for her to follow. She lifted her chin and walked out, her stance rigid, refusing to show fear. They guided her along a narrow stair that led to an interior courtyard used for private executions. She recognized it. Bile rose in her throat at the realization. The sky overhead was faintly pink, the sun not yet cresting the eastern walls. The courtyard was ringed by Tyrell soldiers and a handful of highborn onlookers. Olenna stood with Mace while Tommen was nowhere to be seen, likely too distraught to watch. Or perhaps they had kept him away on purpose. Jaime stood near one corner, flanked by 2 guards, looking anguished and pale. Kevan was present as well, face grimly set. A block of wood had been placed at the center of the yard, with straw scattered around it to soak up blood. An executioner in black stood waiting, an axe gleaming in his hands. At the sight of it, a chill swept over Cersei, yet she kept her face impassive. She stepped forward, shoulders back, as if this were some twisted ceremony. The guards halted her before the block. Olenna spoke in a clear, measured voice. "Cersei Lannister, you have been judged guilty of regicide and treason. Have you any final words?" Cersei's gaze swept the courtyard. She saw Jaime's tortured expression, Kevan's tears, the set jaws of the Tyrell knights. She thought of all the cunning maneuvers, the battles for power, the years spent ensuring her children's ascendance. And here she was. Without flinching, she replied, "Only this, that I die a Lannister, and I curse you all for taking my son. May your precious rose wither in darkness." A hiss of indrawn breath came from the spectators. Olenna's face revealed no flicker of pity. She gave a curt nod to the executioner, who stepped forward. 2 guards forced Cersei to kneel, pressing her neck to the block. She stared at the straw, heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Her hair tumbled around her face. She heard Jaime's voice break, calling her name, but it was distant. Her thoughts swirled with images. Tommen as a baby, Myrcella's sweet smile, Joffrey's cruel grin, her father's stern gaze, her mother's gentle hands. She closed her eyes. She heard the sound of the axe being raised. A sudden silence fell across the courtyard, as though the entire realm held its breath. Then a thunderous roar sounded from above, a shout from the walls. The courtyard erupted in confusion. Cersei's eyes snapped open. She saw soldiers rushing to the parapets, yelling about some disturbance at the gates. The executioner hesitated, glancing at Olenna for instruction. Everything happened in a blur. Jaime and Kevan were both shouting, and Tyrell knights were scrambling. Olenna hissed for them to proceed, but Mace Tyrell looked uncertain as the clamor intensified. Swords scraped from scabbards. A messenger sprinted into the courtyard, panting, lurching to a stop before Olenna. "My lady," he gasped. A large force, flying the banner of House Martell, there at the city gates demanding entry. "They say they've come to avenge the murder of Princess Myrcella in Dorne. They want justice from the Lannisters, and from House Tyrell for harboring them." Cersei's heart hammered. Myrcella murdered? That was impossible. But the shock rattled the courtyard. Another wave of shouting rose above the walls. The messenger continued. "They claim the Lannisters betrayed Dorne, and the Tyrells abetted them by not punishing them sooner. They threaten war if they are not heard." Olenna's face turned from fury to confusion. Mace muttered a curse, his brow breaking out in sweat. A new war? Right at the city gates? Even the Tyrell hold on King's Landing might be jeopardized if a Dornish army pressed an attack. Cersei, still kneeling at the block, felt her mind spin. Myrcella dead, by whose hand? Did Prince Doran remain in power, or had Ilaria Sand and the Sand Snakes seized control? She recalled the tensions that had simmered in Dorne. Now it seemed everything was boiling over. Jaime took advantage of the chaos. He lunged forward, knocking aside the guard who stood next to Cersei. The executioner raised the axe defensively, but Jaime shoved him back with his golden hand, roaring, "Stay back!" Kevin rushed to help, and a pair of Lannister knights who had lingered near the courtyard also sprang into motion. Olenna's eyes blazed. "Stop them! Guard the prisoner!" But the courtyard was in disarray. Half the Tyrell soldiers were already racing to the outer walls to see the new threat, or at least to confirm the reports of the Martell host. Others hesitated, uncertain whether to risk wounding or killing Jaime, which could provoke further conflict with the Westerlands. In that moment, the noose of control loosened. Jaime grabbed Cersei by the arm, hauling her upright. She nearly collapsed against him, still dizzy from the shock and the near-death moment. Kevin and a Lannister knight formed a quick wedge around them, swords drawn, backing away from the block. Olenna's voice rose above the tumult, commanding her men to intercept them, to keep the prisoner from escaping. But Mace Tyrell hesitated, clearly torn between capturing Cersei and dealing with the more immediate threat of a Martell army at the gates. The confusion and panic pulsed in the air. "Run!" Jaime hissed into Cersei's ear. Together, they stumbled backward, evading a Tyrell guard's lunge. Kevin parried another's sword stroke. At least one Lannister knight fell, but the others pressed on. They reached an archway leading out of the courtyard, where two gold cloaks hovered uncertainly. Seeing Jaime's face, the gold cloaks parted, letting them pass. Cersei's mind whirled. She was free for the moment, but how far could they get in a city still controlled by the Tyrells? The arrival of a Martell army added another layer of peril. Had the entire realm gone mad? Or was this some sudden opportunity? Jaime's hand clenched around hers. "We have to get Tommen," he said, breathless. "We can't leave him to the Tyrells if the city is about to become a battlefield." Cersei's heart clenched. "Where is he?" Jaime shook his head. "They keep him in the royal apartments, guarded. But with all the chaos, we might have a chance." Shouts echoed behind them as Tyrell soldiers tried to regroup. The clang of steel on steel rang out, and a swirl of uncertain gold cloaks milled in the corridors. Jaime and Kevin forged ahead, slashing at any who raised a blade against them. Cersei followed, adrenaline pumping through her veins. She was barefoot, her hair disheveled, still wearing the same clothes from her trial, but her resolve flared with a furious, desperate life. They raced down a side stair, across a gallery, and into a hallway that led toward the royal apartments. Along the way, servants and minor courtiers darted aside, shrieking or gasping. The pall of impending chaos weighed on the keep, as rumors of the Martell host spread among the defenders. Just before they reached the main entrance to Tommen's chambers, a group of Tyrell knights blocked their path. 6 men stood with swords drawn, shielding the door. One called out, "Halt! In the name of King Tommen." Jaime did not hesitate. He lunged, his left hand wielding his sword awkwardly, but with the raw fury of a man fighting for family. Kevin and the Lannister knight flanked him, steel clashing in a frenzied melee. Cersei pressed herself to the wall, heart racing, seeking a weapon. She snatched a dagger from the belt of a fallen guard, holding it with trembling determination. In a flurry of blows, Jaime's blade found a gap in one knight's armor, sending him reeling. Kevin parried 2 strikes, though the third nearly knocked him off balance. Blood spattered the corridor floor. The remaining Tyrell men advanced, but at that moment, half the torches guttered as a gust of wind swept through, giving a fleeting moment of confusion. Cersei surged forward and plunged her dagger into the back of one knight, beneath his mail, feeling hot blood spill over her hand. She gasped, pulling the blade free, reeling from the jolt of violence. The knight collapsed with a pained grunt. Jaime finished off another with a desperate swing. The final Tyrell guard hesitated, seeing his comrades fallen, and then he turned to flee, but Kevin tackled him, disarming him. Panting, Cersei and the others burst into the royal apartments. Inside, a pair of Tommen's personal squires cowered in a corner. Across the chamber, Tommen stood in his small clothes, eyes wide with terror. 2 gold cloaks hovered near him, uncertain. "Mother!" he cried out, voice cracking. He rushed forward, nearly stumbling over a footstool. Cersei caught him, clinging to him with fierce desperation. Jaime planted himself near the door, listening for reinforcements. Kevin moved to close the shutters over the windows. Tommen trembled in Cersei's arms, tears streaming down his cheeks. "They said you were... It's all right," she murmured, though nothing was right. She could barely form words, the shock of everything spinning in her head. "We must go." "Go where?" the boy asked, voice choking on sobs. "The Tyrells, they control everything, and now there's a Martell army. They're talking about war." Jaime's eyes blazed with urgency. "We escaped the city. If the Martells breach the walls, we'll be caught in the middle of a slaughter. Or if the Tyrells prevail, they'll put Cersei's head on a spike. We must find a ship, or ride hard for Casterly Rock, or anywhere that isn't here." Tommen stared, uncomprehending. Cersei touched his face, tears blurring her vision. She had been about to die on the block. Now, in this madness, she had one last chance to protect him. "Listen to your uncle," she said. "We have to flee." Kevin cleared his throat, voice shaking. "My lady, my king, there's no time to gather anything. We must move now, if we're to slip through the city unnoticed." They gathered what they could. A cloak for Tommen, a tunic for Jaime to replace his bloodied armor, and for Cersei, a plain cloak that could hide her disheveled state. The gold cloaks seemed willing to stand aside, perhaps confused by the swirl of shifting loyalties or simply unwilling to raise a blade against the king himself. They spilled back into the corridor, hearts pounding. Down below, in the grand courtyard, more chaos reigned. Soldiers were massing, presumably to shore up the gates against the Dornish. Shouts rang out from the walls, and the clang of metal drifted upward. For the moment, the Tyrells seemed too distracted to mount a coordinated search for Cersei. Jaime led the way through a side corridor, into a narrower passage seldom used. Kevin followed, guiding Tommen, while Cersei trailed them, a dagger still clutched in her hand. A hush hovered in that dark corridor, broken only by their hurried footsteps. Dust and cobwebs told her that few had walked this way in years. They descended steps into an older courtyard, small and walled, where they found four Lannister guards huddled. Whether by design or happenstance, these men had not joined the Tyrell cause. They recognized Jaime and Kevin, saluting with relief. One guard stammered, "Sir Jaime, Lord Kevin. There's fighting near the stables. Tyrell men locking down the gates." "We need safe passage," Jaime said swiftly. "We have the king and we're leaving the Red Keep. We'll find a way out." The guards nodded, tense. "We'll follow you," one said. "We're done letting Tyrells order us about." Together, the small band skirted the edges of the keep, slipping through half-blocked corridors and seldom-used doors. Occasionally, they encountered pockets of Tyrell knights or gold cloaks, but the swirl of confusion and the knowledge that Tommen was present caused most to pause, uncertain how to respond. The group pressed on with unwavering urgency. At last, they emerged near the stables in an open courtyard, where half a dozen Tyrell soldiers had set up a barricade. The instant the Lannisters appeared, the soldiers shouted a challenge. Jaime brandished his sword. Kevin bellowed for them to stand aside in the name of the king, but the Tyrell men tightened their formation. Cersei felt Tommen quivering beside her. She gritted her teeth. If they didn't break through here, they would be trapped. More forces would converge, and the escape would fail. She briefly considered stepping forward and ordering them aside, but she knew these men answered only to their Tyrell commanders. Time slowed as the Tyrell soldiers advanced. Jaime braced for another fight, battered from the earlier melee. Kevin raised his sword. The four loyal Lannister guards positioned themselves in front of Tommen and Cersei, creating a small protective ring. Tension spiked, the threat of another bloodbath looming. Then a single arrow whistled through the air, catching one of the Tyrell soldiers in the side. He let out a yelp, staggering. Another arrow came from a different angle, felling a second Tyrell man. Alarmed, the remaining soldiers turned, trying to spot the source. A shadow moved atop a low wall, releasing another shaft that slammed into a third Tyrell's neck. Chaos erupted. The Tyrell line broke. One soldier bolted, the others tried to form up, but the archer's vantage gave them no time. Jaime seized the opportunity and led a charge, slashing down the nearest foe. Kevin's guard stabbed another. Within moments, the barricade was overrun, and the courtyard was clear. Cersei stood trembling, eyeing the top of the wall. A figure in a hooded cloak knocked another arrow, but then paused, lowering the bow. The figure lifted a hand in greeting. Was that Bronn? The stance seemed familiar. A flash of dark hair, the glint of a smirk from beneath the hood. Jaime recognized him and raised his sword in thanks. Bronn waved once more, then disappeared into the shadows. No time to dwell on it. With the barricade broken, they rushed to the stables. Most of the horses had been claimed by Tyrell men or the city watch, but a few still stood in stalls, neglected in the confusion. Jaime, Kevin, and the guards swiftly saddled them. Tommen needed help mounting. Cersei grabbed a cloak from a peg, throwing it over her shoulders. Moments later, they were riding out of the stables, hearts pounding. In the distance, the city gates might be sealed, but King's Landing was vast, and there were smaller postern gates, old sally ports, hidden ways that only a few locals knew. They galloped through narrow streets, passing frightened townsfolk who dived out of the way. Everywhere they looked, tension simmered. Barricades lined some roads. Soldiers from both the Gold Cloaks and the Tyrell camp marched in formation, presumably heading for the gates to confront the Martell threat. A dull roar of alarm bells reverberated through the city. Smoke curled from a tower near the walls. They reached the older southwestern quarter, where the buildings were older and the streets narrower. Jaime halted the group in a side alley, dismounting to check that the postern gate route was still passable. Kevin remained with Tommen, scanning the roads for pursuers. Cersei clutched her horse's reins, still gripping the dagger with one hand. Her heart hammered at the possibility of escape. But where would they go? They might slip out of King's Landing, only to find themselves in a realm at war. The Martells evidently blamed the Lannisters for Myrcella's death. The Tyrells were certainly not going to let Cersei roam free, but perhaps they could ride west, toward the safety of Casterly Rock, muster what remains of Lannister power, and hold out for, what? Another civil war? She turned to Tommen, who gazed at her with wide, tear-stained eyes. His entire world had unraveled. "Mother," he whispered, "is Myrcella really?" Cersei felt tears prick her eyes. "I don't know," she said, her voice cracking, "but we'll find out, I promise." He nodded, swallowing back sobs. She stroked his hair, murmuring words of reassurance she barely believed. At least they had each other, whatever lay ahead. Jaime returned, breathless. "A group of Tyrell men stands near the river gate, but if we use the old postern by the southwestern tower, we might slip out under the aqueduct. We'll have to hurry, though." Kevin gave a grim nod. "Lead on." Together, they pushed forward, clattering through side streets. A handful of city folk recognized the king, or recognized the gold of Lannister hair, and some jeered while others gazed in confusion. The entire city was in tumult, with rumors swirling of an approaching Dornish assault. In that swirl, the small band might yet slip away like a fish in muddy water. At last, they reached the postern gate. It was locked from the inside by a heavy iron bar. 2 gold cloaks stood guard, but they seemed bewildered by the day's chaos, uncertain if they should keep the gate sealed or not. When Jaime approached and demanded they open it in the king's name, one guard nearly complied, but then the other recognized Cersei and hesitated. "She's under sentence," the guard stammered. "We can't let her go," the Tyrells said. "King's orders override the Tyrells," Jaime barked, brandishing his blade. "Open the gate now, or I'll hang you for treason." The 2 guards exchanged fearful glances. One stuttered, I don't want trouble. And then he pulled the bar free. Kevin and the Lannister guards rushed to push the door open. An arch of pale daylight appeared beyond. They led the horses out, the hooves clattering on the narrow stone ramp that descended beyond the city walls. Outside, a shallow ravine followed the aqueduct, lined with patches of scrub grass. In the distance, the roads leading away from King's Landing stretched uncertainly. Jaime spurred his horse forward. Kevin, Tommen, and Cersei followed, flanked by the last loyal Lannister guards. They paused at the top of a slope, turning to see the city behind them. The walls bristled with soldiers. War horns sounded. Plumes of smoke rose from some quarter near the dragon pit. The armies of House Tyrell and House Martell might soon clash in the streets, or perhaps the Tyrells would negotiate. But for Cersei and Tommen, the city was no longer their home. A wave of dizziness nearly overwhelmed her as she realized just how close she had come to dying at dawn. The realm was in flames again. Without speaking, Jaime took the lead, guiding them onto a winding path that veered west. The wind caught Cersei's cloak, whipping it around her shoulders. She looked back one last time at the towers of the Red Keep, shining in the early sun. She tasted bitterness on her tongue. They rode on, away from the city that had once bowed to House Lannister. Tommen stared back, tears slipping down his cheeks, as the place he had known all his life receded into the distance. Kevin took a deep breath, steel in his eyes. The Lannister guards murmured to one another, uncertain of what future awaited them. In Cersei's heart, a swirl of emotions reigned. The heartbreak of leaving Myrcella's fate unknown, the guilt of Joffrey's death, the near execution that had hovered over her, and the anger that still burned hot when she thought of Margaery Tyrell. She had lost everything she once grasped, save for Tommen and Jaime, and now the road stretched out before them, a question with no answer. Behind them, King's Landing roiled in conflict. Ahead, the Westerlands beckoned, though how safe it might be was anyone's guess. The power of the Lion had waned. The Rose had seized control of the capital, but the Viper of Dorne coiled at its doorstep. The realm stood on the brink of yet another conflagration, its lords locked in cycles of vengeance. Cersei Lannister pressed her heels to her horse's flanks, urging it onward. She felt Tommen's presence beside her, heard the ragged breathing of Jaime behind. She was alive, exiled in her own homeland, stripped of titles and power. But she was not finished yet. No matter what curses the Tyrells might cast her way, no matter the knives of Dorne. For now, she had her son, her brother, and the battered remnants of House Lannister's pride. That would have to be enough. She would survive. She would plot. And though she did not know what shape the future would take, she knew one truth above all. As long as she drew breath, the game continued. And so they rode west, the morning sun warming their backs, leaving behind a city braced for war and a realm poised on the edge of chaos. The memory of Margaery Tyrell's final breath and the blood that stained Cersei's hands cast a long shadow over them all. But in a land ruled by the interplay of cunning, ambition, and violence, there were always new moves to make, new alliances to forge or betray. High in the sky, a murder of crows wheeled above King's Landing. Below, the banners of Rose and Viper began their deadly dance. And on a winding road to the west, a ragged band of lions rode into an uncertain sunrise, each harboring silent vows for what would come next.